There we go. All right. Before I start, I just want to just mention some of my collaborators on this. Ashmita and Gupta did a lot of the hydrologic modeling, and she'll be leading the workshop that's going on tomorrow on hydrology. Jason May collaborated on a lot of the biological response modeling, as well as Brian Bledsoe from University of Georgia. So I just wanted to thank them. Their names didn't show up here. So as Eric mentioned, hydrology is a master driver of stream condition, and the negative side is that when you alter hydrology, you can mess up 100,000 things that will end up affecting the biological integrity of your site. But the positive way of looking at this is that you actually have this one tool at your disposal that can really have a pervasive impact on protecting or improving biological condition. If you can mitigate flow alteration, then you can probably have a really profound impact on the other consequences on integrity. So how do you know, how do you manage your flows? How do you set targets for them? The challenge, as Eric mentioned, is relating changes in biology to changes in hydrology. That is, you want to compare delta B to delta H. For measuring changes in biology, California, we've got a really great tool at our disposal, the California Stream Condition Index. Because it's a measurement of, you're comparing observed biology to the biology you would expect to find under historic or reference conditions, it really already is an expression of change in biology. If you're interested in looking at other biological endpoints like our algae indices or maybe another IBI, there's certainly that works well with this approach, but you have to be a little bit more cautious about some of the confounding effects of natural factors. Because we're using this CSCI, we didn't have to worry quite as much about things like different stream typologies, because we know this index can sort of tamp out some of that influence. The much bigger challenge, of course, is measuring delta H, particularly at ungauged streams. Now, unlike biology, you can't just go to a site and visit it and say, okay, I know what the hydrologic conditions are. You really need years and years of data from a flow gauge to really figure out what the hydrology looks like at a site, and that's simply not an option many times. And if that weren't hard enough, you have to know what the historic hydrology used to look like. Jason actually talked about one approach for doing this. He said it was an empirical, not process-based approach, and actually what I'm going to talk about today is more of what we call a process-based approach. I can tell you a little bit more about what that means later. So why are ungauged sites so important to us? Well, there's two reasons. Our study area was in Southern California, and if we were just to focus on the areas where we had bioassessment data and flow data, we were talking about maybe 100 sites, and probably a lot less than that if you really want to filter out some of the poor data records or low data quality. So that really doesn't provide, in our case at least, a good foundation for modeling. It certainly, you want more than just a handful of sites to really base these biological response models. If you're able to take advantage of your bioassessment data sets, we had hundreds and hundreds of sites, and these are from programs like the PSA or the RCMP that Pete mentioned, as well as in SoCal we have the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition. So we've got these really robust data sets and really want to take advantage of them. So in addition to that though, you really need to have tools that you can apply to ungauged streams, because we can't really just say that we're going to try to focus on flow alteration where we've measured flow. We really need tools that will work in other types of streams. So the way we tried to predict flows at ungauged sites, we really operated under the assumption that if you understand how flows look at a stream where you do have information, you can extrapolate that to similar sites if they have enough catchment similarities. So what we did is we created an ensemble of watershed models. We took very simple rainfall runoff models, PEC HMS models, that basically say that rainfall plus watershed characteristics equals your discharge. So if you have these models, you can estimate hourly or daily discharge at your sites. We create a whole library of them, and in our case we looked at 26 different gauges in Southern California. It might not sound like a lot, but we really just wanted to focus on a few gauges where we thought we could develop really, models of sufficient quality. You take your new site, and then you look to your library, your ensemble, and say, which is the best model for this new site? And we did this matching based on catchment properties, so things like watershed area, imperviousness, geology, and climate. So you can take that model right off the shelf, and most of your parameters you've already calibrated for your original the original stream gauge. You can update a few characteristics, things like, what's the new watershed area like? What's the rainfall patterns like at my new site? And you can run this model to generate discharge data that show you what the current conditions are like. And because you have these, this discharge data, this hourly or daily discharge, you can calculate a whole suite of flow metrics that really characterize current hydrologic conditions. If you tweak a few metrics, for example, you could set imperviousness close to 0. That might help you estimate your reference or historic conditions. The metrics you calculate from that, you can compare them to your current conditions, and that's your measure of delta H. So we characterized these hydrographs using a large suite of flow metrics. Mostly these were from Chris Conrad and some of the scripts that he developed, but they really get at trying to characterize different aspects of what a flow regime looks like. We had a number of magnitude metrics. We had metrics that looked at duration of high and low flows. We had duration of frequency of high and low flow events, variability, and we also looked at timing metrics, just knowing that timing of flows are particularly important in Mediterranean regions in California. And I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail about this, but I'll tell you that we found that our process for estimating these flow metrics, when we compared them to validation gauges, we did really well with the magnitude metrics, and we did pretty well when we were looking at duration and frequency of high flow events. It was a lot harder for us to look at variability in the hydrographs. Duration and frequency of low flows were also really difficult for us. And I think this actually has to do with the fact that low flow metrics and variability metrics might be heavily influenced by some local factors as opposed to just catchment scale factors. In general, and this is something that Jason alluded to earlier, you really need good rainfall data to run these models. And in Southern California, this by and large wasn't a problem, but there were certain areas, particularly like northern San Diego County, where we didn't have a lot of rainfall gauges to inform our models. And so we were a little hamstrung in that. So we couldn't use this at every site we wanted to, but we could estimate this at hundreds of ungauged streams. So Eric actually showed you this graph. I'm going to walk through it really quickly. But the idea is that when you have a measure of hydrologic alteration, you can compare it to your biological response and use that for modeling. And I just want to say, in this case, this is a little preliminary analysis we did based on duration of high flow events. That dotted line represents unaltered streams. There's a lot more points to the left than on the right, and this is consistent with what we understand the way we manage streams. We tend to shorten the duration of floods. We tend not to lengthen them. So this is good validation of that. And you see that the response is really happening more on the left side, not the right side. So these times when we've increased duration of flows, it hasn't had a huge impact on the biology, but when we've decreased it, there is a negative response. So we tried to develop these models for all of the flow metrics that we had available. We looked at the CSCI as a response variable. We looked at all the components of the CSCI, which, if you're familiar with it, there's an O to E index, there's a multi-metric index, and there's a number of metrics. They're all predictive indices, so they're all good measures of delta B. And we looked at the increasing and decreasing gradients independently. So we looked at what's the effect of increasing peak flows, what's the effect of decreasing peak flows. We knew that you can have a lot of factors affecting biological condition independent of hydrologic alteration, and to sort of reduce some of this confounding, we looked at the frequency of degraded sites where alteration was 0, and so we scaled to that to get rid of like the background level of the impact of altered hydrology on biology. Because we looked at a variety of biological endpoints, we selected the most conservative targets we could find across these 9 different endpoints. Now, it's great that you can develop these targets for a suite of 39 metrics. You have, increasing targets, decreasing targets. That's a lot of numbers to work with. We thought it'd be a lot more convenient for a management application if you could just synthesize into a simple hydrologic index. And this is based on a lot of the work that Jason did. We basically looked at the influence of each of these different hydrologic measures when you characterize them as a delta H, and we tried to predict CSCI scores and all the other endpoints based on the kitchen suite of flow metrics. And that helped us rank these metrics in terms of their influence on biological condition. We then went through and tried to select the most influential variables. We tried to avoid selecting more than 2 metrics in class. We had no more than 2 duration metrics, 2 frequency metrics. And we ended up selecting 7. As it turned out, the timing metrics didn't really have a good relationship with biology, so we didn't pick any of those. And we applied a fairly simple scoring system. So if our metrics were within our targets, we gave it a 0. If it exceeded a target, we gave it 1 point. And if it exceeded the target by more than twice the target value, we gave it 2 points. And that basically lets you measure some of the severity of alteration. We had 7 metrics, we added up the score, and that gives us an index that ranges from 0 for our hydrologically unaltered systems to 14 for a system that's been pretty severely and pervasively altered. So we have this index. It's pretty easy to apply at your ungaged sites. So what do we do with it? We decide to see what the entire region in Southern California looked like. In this case, the pale dots are those that are unaltered. And it's not that surprising, but they're mostly located in our undeveloped catchments in the mountains, the Santa Monica Mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains, as well as east of San Diego in the countryside there. And more of our urban streams, our agricultural streams, are in that dark red category where you have fairly pervasive alteration. To be in that class D, that means that every metric you had showed signs of alteration. Now, because we could apply this to probabilistic data, we could make some extent estimates to say what's the extent of unaltered or altered streams. And we saw some not too surprising relationships with land use. For example, unaltered streams are pretty extensive in our undeveloped catchments, and they're really rare in our urban catchments. And we could compare different watersheds. And there actually were a handful of surprises here. I'm going to point out the Santa Monica Bay watershed. You can see that there actually wasn't much hydrologic alteration there. But if you compare this to results when you look at just the biological index by itself, the CSCI, if you pick it out, there's actually very few streams in good biological condition in that watershed. So that gives some indication that there might be causes unrelated to hydrology causing most of the problems in that area. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. So one nice application of this index is that you can use it to prioritize management actions on a fairly large scale, fairly rapidly. So what I'm showing you an example here is, like, let's say this x-axis now is just your index of alteration. It doesn't matter. You can look at a specific metric. It doesn't take your pick. On the y-axis, you have a measure of biological condition. And then you can categorize streams into one of these 4 boxes. Your streams that are healthy with unaltered biology, these are the streams that, of course, you want to protect because they're still in good condition. You want to keep them that way. Rarely we observe streams that were in good condition, but hydrologic alteration was observed. And these might be because the alteration wasn't as severe as our models estimated, or it could be that there's some sort of natural resilience going on in these systems. Maybe the local reaches are confined to bedrock, and so they're not going to respond to changes in peak flows. Or it could be that the ecology at these sites are taxa that are more resilient to hydrologic alteration than you'd expect. So these types of systems are currently in good shape. You want to monitor the factors that are contributing to this resilience, make sure that things don't get worse. There's a large number of streams we observed that were in poor biological condition, and you had altered hydrology, and these are the sites where you want to really consider flow management as one of your options when you're trying to figure out what you have to fix. And then the streams where you have poor biology, but unaltered hydrology, then you want to look at other factors. And this could be what we have going on in Santa Monica Bay. Maybe you focus on water chemistry or things like direct habitat alteration. We were able to apply this sort of rapid screening across the region, and so you can just see color coding of dots. And again, in our mountainous areas is where you want to do most of the protection or the monitoring of resilience. In our urban streams is where you really want to consider your flow options. And so this is just an example of how you can do the beginnings of sort of a rapid causal assessment. These would be a nice first step in sort of figuring out where you should be looking at flow management as your options. I'm going to talk about a few examples from a case study we did in the San Diego River. This is a watershed, near San Diego. It provides a lot of the drinking water for that city, and so we wanted to see a number of factors, how these tools might work out for a number of different management scenarios. I'm just going to walk you through a few of these just to give you a sense of the potential applications of some flow ecology tools. So Santee Lakes it's a reservoir near San Diego. It discharges into Sycamore Creek, and there's discussion about redirecting that water use to other purposes, for example, supplementing the drinking water. And we wanted to know what would the impact of that reuse of water be on the downstream on one of the sites downstream. If you look at the top, this is what we estimate the current hydrology to be, and the next row shows a hydrograph representing these future conditions when we've redirected the discharge. And the third panel here represents the historical reference conditions. And easily, you can see that we're bringing it much more in line with what the hydrograph used to look like if we redirect those discharges. And if you compare the metrics, you can see that we've returned a good number of them to their historic conditions. Alvarado Creek is a tiny tributary. It's near the San Diego State University campus. And it's a fairly urbanized watershed. It's about 50% urban. It's about as high as you get for a watershed that size. And we wanted to know what are our different options, what kind of BMPs should we look at for improving conditions. So how can we restore the biological condition at the site through flow management? So we wanted to see if you reduce the imperviousness through increased infiltration basins or other options, how effective would that be at restoring your flows to levels that are conducive to high CSCI scores? We found that at 25% imperviousness didn't really make enough of a difference. At 10% imperviousness, the peak flows were within target, but the mean flows were still they were still elevated. And so we said, this is already, 10% imperviousness is really hard to reach. It's not too realistic. We did, however, look at capturing stormwater, the 85% of the volume of a 24-hour storm, and this option was actually much more effective in helping us meet those targets. This is a map of all the different catchments in the San Diego River, and the yellow and the green sites in the upper watershed show that there's not too much alteration going on in the upper watershed. And that's good because, again, this is the source of most of the drinking water for the city of San Diego. However, the county plan actually stipulates that there's plans for quite a bit of development in this watershed. That's those sort of brownish colors on that right panel there are areas that are supposed to be residential. So we wanted to see what would happen if this watershed developed according to the plan, but without any sort of special precautions to mitigate these impacts. And you can see that a number of these green watersheds turn yellow, some of the yellow watersheds turn orange. And that's really a good way to know which are the most vulnerable to these changes. And that can really help prioritize protection efforts. So what I'm presenting here are pretty simple models. These rainfall runoff models, they don't really incorporate activities of dams or groundwater, but they do provide a good foundation for really exploring how you could set targets in order to protect biological integrity. We think, of course, it's important to look a little bit more broadly than just focusing on CSCI scores. So we would like to try to expand these to include riparian indicators, vertebrates, algae indices once they're available, but also we want to focus on things like processes, like what's the relationship between flow alteration and eutrophication or cyanotoxin production. Ultimately, we would like to tie these tools into some simple causal assessment screening tools, and this is something that I think Calvin has been working on for the regions in Southern California. Can you make some rapid causal assessment tools based on these types of indices, given just a simple GIS data and CSCI scores? So that's what we're working on now. With that, I guess I can take questions, or I'll wait for the panel.
So I'd say if there's one or two burning questions, otherwise we'll have time we have a panel discussion at the end. Any burning clarifications for Rafi or? All right, everybody's.